Hello everyone, and welcome to a Good Governance Academy webinar. We are the proud sponsors of this webinar today, hosted by CCON and NBI. The discussion today is another thought leadership event around a critical business issue, and that's the results essentially and the impact of South Africa hosting the G20 and of course, importantly, the B20 for our discussion today. For those who are new to the Good Governance Academy, we host these thought leadership events on critical business issues. We also provide training and evaluations and assistance around all matters associated with our events. We provide a journal where both practitioners as well as academics can come together and talk about these critical business issues in a more scholastic environment. With that, I'm not going to take too much time, so welcome everybody. I'm going to hand over now to Wendy Poulton to take us through today's event. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Carolynn, and welcome everybody. I'm just going to allow Shameela just to say a few words because as Carolynn mentioned, this is a joint webinar between ourselves as CCON, the Sustainability and ESG Africa Conference, as well as NBI and Good Governance. So Shameela, over to you.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you, Carolynn. So not a lot from my side, except to say we're hugely excited to be working with CCON and with GGA on doing something like this. So thank you to both organizations. It's fantastic about the collaborative space, but also because of the huge amount of overlap, but I think mutual interest in the agendas that we're each dealing with. So it's a great coming together of all of those. I'm hoping that the topic is going to be of interest. I think for me also a big thank you to all our panelists there. Cass, of course, our B20, outgoing B20 Sherpa. And of course, I'm slightly prejudiced because he's also the NBI board chair. And then, of course, Geoff, who all of you will know very well. So really good to be doing this. I think what I would encourage is a lot of questions about how you see this playing out, but I think also comments, because we have our perspectives, but it's always wonderful to hear from the community what they're seeing playing out and how they think those can be taken forward for organizations like those around the table.
As both Shameela and Carolynn have said, we're here really to look at the outcomes of the G20 and the B20, but with a specific lens about the business side of things and the benefits of participation in this, what I think was a very successful event that was held in South Africa. But at the end of the day, we need to look at what impact is it having, and particularly the impact and benefits for African business to participate in that. So that's what we're going to dive into in a little bit more detail today. So we're very lucky to have our three panelists. So as Shameela said, Cass, who was the B20 Sherpa, Shameela herself, who's the CEO of NBI and participated in a number of the business but also intergovernmental sessions that happened, and Geoff, who's with GGA but also wears many hats, and I think is also, we're going to be pulling on his experience with the NEPAD Business Foundation to give us some of that African perspective as well. So we're going to start off by just having a presentation from Kaz to give us his perspective as the B20 Sherpa as to how things went, how they worked, and what some of the major outcomes were. So Kaz, over to you.
Thanks, Wendy, and my colleagues, and welcome to all our guests. I hope it's going to be an interactive session. I have 20 minutes, and I'm going to run through some of the critical issues related to both the B20 and the G20. I'm going to try and focus more on the B20 because this is an NBI seminar. NBI is involved and has plenty business membership. So I want to focus on the business part of the G20 process. As Wendy said, my name's Coovadia. I have been the Sherpa for the B20 South Africa last year. Still committed to that until the end of March because I'll talk a little bit to that, what we want to do beyond the B20. We had a pretty good relationship with the G20 during the course of the year. We sponsored a number of dinners at G20 ministerials. We had panels with the ministers and others during some of the G20 ministerials. We kept in touch with some of the critical people in our government related to the G20, and we developed our recommendations and so on. So there was a good relationship and good progress in ensuring that we're on the same page. The G20 theme, as people may know, was solidarity, equality, and sustainability. I think in today's geopolitics, very, very important, all three of those. And we tried to look at the theme as the B20 that's more business-oriented, but talked to the G20 theme. And the B20 theme has been inclusive growth and prosperity through global cooperation. So inclusive growth is critical, prosperity is critical, and global cooperation in today's world that's being rent asunder by many developments is important. The G20's sort of critical focus was sustainable finance, addressing debt vulnerability, particularly in the global south, advocating for reform of the global financial architecture. And I think those are all very, very important themes. We then looked at what's important for business, and we essentially had 8 task forces. I'm not going to go through all of them, but ranging from trade and industry to digital transformation to energy mix and just transition to industrialization to business and ethics to food security and agriculture and a couple others. And we came out with a number of critical areas that informed the recommendations we made to the G20. So the first one is to empower Africa's digital and skills transformation. We all say that Africa is to a certain extent making great progress in the digital area, and we are. But we need to look at things like regulation. We need to ensure that digitalization is also ethical and responsible in the way we actually promote it and advance it. So a number of issues related to that. Then to unlock Africa's industrialization in the critical minerals value chain. Now, we added a task force at the 8th task force, and that was industrial transformation, because we felt that industrial transformation and the reindustrialization, if you like, of the continent is critical to business and to governance. And so to unlock Africa's industrialization in the critical minerals value chain was a critical theme that came up. Then to drive food security through stronger agricultural value chain. And a lot of these talk to putting Africa at the center of the agenda. We were absolutely clear that Africa will be at the center of the agenda for the B20 as it was for the G20. And the fact that we agreed on recommendations that were also signed off in the task forces by other G20 countries, including countries from the north and others. We achieved that by ensuring that we positioned Africa's growth and development and Africa's success not just as relevant for the continent, but as relevant for the world. Because Africa has the resources that the global economy needs. So on digitalization, we have minerals that the digital economy needs. We are leapfrogging some aspects of digitalization on the continent from which the globe can actually leverage. On industrialization, we have critical minerals, but we need to process them to value add. So industrialization is critical to that. And if we value add our minerals and export finished goods as well, that's important to Africa's development and Africa's development, given our demographics and so on, and important to the globe. Driving food security, Africa has some of the largest amount of arable land in the world. And if we manage that properly, Africa can actually make a significant contribution to the food insecurity problems of the globe. Covering infrastructure and industry is the next one through capital access. And this one is critical to Africa itself, because Africa's infrastructure backlog is critical, and we need to develop industries on the continent. And through capital access, again, talks to one of the G20 issues of unlocking financial capital, as well as addressing the debt vulnerability of the company. And so powering infrastructure and industry through capital access is critical. And building sustainable and climate responsive economies, economic systems. Again, Africa has wind, so sun, minerals that are important. Cleaner energy for the energy requirements of the world. And so it's critical that we build that on the continent. And fostering business resilience and market stability. And here we also looked at things like the fact that there's a risk premium placed on Africa that is unjustified. And that risk premium is placed on Africa because rating agencies and others do not actually see the resilience of many countries in Africa as an asset. And that resilience will enable them to manage risk and so on. And we're tackling the risk issue head on. We believe that a strong, frank conversation needs to be had with rating agencies. We believe that they do not utilize appropriate information to inform the ratings on the continent. During the course of last year, one of the rating agencies announced that they increasing their presence on the continent. And one of the reasons for that was to understand the continent better. That then raises a question on what basis and on what data and on what understanding have they been rating countries up to now. So the whole issue about rating, which leads to risk, which also addresses the debt issues, is a critical issue. And then building competitive markets by empowering women, upgrading SMEs, and championing safe and healthy workspaces on the continent. And we were very deliberate in the South Africa B20. We decided to make a call that we won't have a separate task force for women and SMEs. Instead, we asked the chairs of all our task forces to hard code and centralize women development and SME development in each of the task forces. So they were at the center of the discussions on, for instance, trade and investment, on finance and infrastructure. And the recommendations each task force came out with also referred to how in that particular area, women will be empowered and SMEs will be empowered. We made sure that there was sufficient women public participation and SME participation in the task forces as well. So those were some of the critical things that came out of the B20. And we believe that talks to the G20 as well. And in the current geopolitics, we believe that we need to reposition the continent to actually play the critical role it must play. One of the sort of words that just featured throughout the year in our B20 was the word reset. And we were absolutely clear that what's happening in the global economy offers an opportunity to reset trade and investment relationships, to form different alliances, to reset some of the global architecture. So organizations like the WTO, for instance, must be reset to ensure that they represent the growing economies of the South, and that they talk to those economies as well, not to the exclusion of others, but give substantially more credence to the fact that it's a very fast-changing geopolitical and economic world, and the world, the multilateral institutions need to recognize that and need to be structured to be representative of that. So those were some of the critical issues that came out. Now, where to from here? We, and not because I was Sherpa, but all the feedback we received from countries that were there, from CEOs that were there, was that this was the best B20 they attended. And it's hats off to South Africa. And we had a meeting on the last day in the afternoon. We had a structure called the International Business Advisory Caucus, which was made up of past chairs of B20s and global CEOs. And about 15 of them were at the B20. So we took the opportunity to bring them together physically because we'd been meeting online. And the assessment of the B20 was phenomenal. They said we received them not just as business people, but as friends. They were blown away by South Africa's hospitality. They were blown away with our ability to pull together the best B20 that's ever been had, not just from the point of view of the event we had, but the content of the event. They were blown away by our food. And a number of them said that they came to this B20 with a particular perception of South Africa and the continent. And they're going away with a perception that will inform their future investment decisions. And that's all we wanted to hear. So I think we positioned the continent in a particular way, in a very positive way. And we quite clear, and we've been meeting a number of CEOs, both in South Africa and the rest of the continent. And that's what we're doing until the end of March. We're quite clear that we need to keep the momentum going. The recommendations that were handed over to the G20, about 30 of them, must now begin to be implemented. And we want to look at how we start doing that on the continent. Do we put together a group of CEOs that drive that? Do we do that in a different way? But we definitely want to keep the momentum going, and we want to turn some of the recommendations into implementation, because the recommendations were structured in a way that these are the stuff that need to be implemented. This is who should be implemented, and this should be the impact. And so we're doing a lot of work on maintaining the momentum, taking this forward on the continent, and putting together some structure on the continent that interacts on behalf of the continent on these issues, and talks on behalf of the continent in global fora like the G20 and elsewhere. And so that's what we're focusing on. I think this is also especially critical because we've handed over to the U.S. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington was very supportive of our B20. U.S. business was very supportive. We had very good representation on our task forces. We had very good attendance at the B20. But the U.S. Chamber, and even on the B20 level, have pulled things back considerably. And I can understand the situation there. We're not, as you know, in the G20 because somebody felt we shouldn't be there. I think that what we certainly want to do now is to work with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as much as we can, and we will continue to do that. But we're also starting to talk to the UK and UK business because they're taking over in 2027. And we want to ensure that what we develop in our B20, including the recommendations, does have continuity. We don't believe it will have much continuity in the US, but we will prime the Congress of British Industries, who will be the hosts of the B20 in the UK, to pick up the pieces and to take some of our recommendations and ensure there's continuity through their hosting. And we'll work with them on that. So we're doing a lot of work now to ensure that what we did is sustainable. We start implementing. We, in a real way, keep Africa on the table. And as Mark Carney said, not be part of the menu, but be at the table. And we will ensure continuity of what we developed. And that's our focus going in the next period, post the B20. Those are the sort of critical issues that came out. And we put together, a grouping of CEOs during the B20 that top class to chair all the task forces. We had a top-class team. I still say it's the best team I've worked with, and I've been in this for a long time, of primarily secondments from corporates. And that team came together unbelievably well. The accolades we've received from the team has been amazing. So we can't let all of that go to waste. And we're going to spend the next period ensuring that it doesn't go to waste. And ensure that these recommendations are implemented. So let me stop there. and then we can take questions and discuss more issues in the panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Cass, for that really great insight into the outcomes. So we're going to come back to questions. I see people are putting them in the Q&A. Thank you very much. We will get back to that, but I just want to give Shameela a chance first to just talk through her points from the business side as well.
Thank you, Wendy, and good afternoon, whichever part in the world you are, morning. Thanks for joining us. Wendy, thank you. And it was always a tough act to follow on Cass, and Cass has given such a fantastic overview. What I want to do is to speak a little bit about where we've seen the greatest alignments between the B20 and the G20. And I think the process demonstrated that business engagement is becoming more structured, technically grounded, and definitely increasingly influential in shaping the G20 outcomes, particularly in the areas critical to emerging markets. Cass has pointed out some of those. So we're talking about financial reform, industrialization, energy transition, and the just transition principles. And who better than South Africa to actually be able to lead on some of those and just to try and put them more firmly on the agenda. So in line with the theme of moving from alignment to implementation, I think that question around how do we make sure that that is actually implemented, and reflecting a little bit on the G20 leaders and the finance ministers' communiques, how do we translate that? And so we really want to keep our eyes on capital mobilization, project delivery, and measurable economic outcomes for Africa. And central to all of this is absolutely going to be the leadership that is necessary to carry this forward. So we've demonstrated a lot of how that can be possible at the start. Cass spent a lot of time talking about just how we formulated those task teams and the kind of leadership that we saw coming through. And to the extent that I was involved in some of those, it was really a feel-good moment to be able to sit and say, well, this is coming from us and we're leading that. So again, complete hats off to the process on the B20, the leadership that came through there, Cass's work in that space, and the organizers particularly for being able to pull that together. Also, I think the speed at which credible documents came out, opportunities for engagement, and that sort of thing. But in the actual looking at the themes for the B20 and then moving to G20 adoption, it's often not clear to people, and I'm hoping this is going to be helpful to look at where the alignment came through. Cass gave the overview of the theme for the G20 as a whole, and then we've spoken a little bit about where the B20 comes in. So I want to touch on three key ones that I think we saw really good alignment coming through, and you could see how a B20 process followed into a G20. I was one of those, completely new to this, asking the question, is that even going to make it? Because the processes seem to run at different paces. Does the G20 actually listen to the B20, and so on and so forth? But the areas we saw that coming through quite clearly, firstly, was looking at, for example, the financial architecture reform. So the G20 outcomes reflected, I think, a growing recognition that mobilizing private capital into emerging markets is going to require systemic reform. We've touched on that, including the multilateral development bank, capital adequacy, your blended finance instruments, and the risk mitigation mechanisms. Cass did touch on looking at that and assessment of risk and credit ratings on the continent, absolutely critical. But the alignment also didn't happen automatically. It does reflect sustained pressure from technical input from the B20 and other engagement groups. The second broad area is the energy transition and the link to industrialization. So the G20 language has certainly shifted from climate compliance, for example, into economic opportunity, looking at critical minerals and green value chains, energy security, and industrial competitiveness. And so that framing strongly mirrors the B20 advocacy that decarbonization also needs to look at being economically enabling, and particularly for developing economies. And so the opportunity there for us, of course, is to be able to say, how are we aligning our industrial strategies to be able to make sure that we can pick up on the upside of these transitions, and that we're very focused and deliberate about doing that. Then thirdly, broadly, I wanted to touch on supply chain resilience. So the G20 outcomes acknowledge over-concentration risks and the need for diversification. So that creates strategic opening for African economies, but only if we position ourselves to capture that value and not merely be a supplier of raw inputs. And so this opportunity to reset, which Cass spoke about, includes the nature of the relationship with the continent, again to underscore the shift from what has largely been into a meaningful and deep partnership that respects what the continent has to offer. And there are a few areas, critical minerals being underscored, and in particularly in relation to the transition, how important that is going to be. Most of those minerals sit on this continent. What are we going to do? And this is the opportunity for leadership to turn those into strategic assets and hopefully not into sort of opaque bilateral agreements and we don't know what's happened to those resources. So I think that is the opportunity, is that our industrial planning can be able to leverage off what we have here, and that those relationships become more of a mutually beneficial rather than primarily extractive. And I think that is the huge opportunity we have. Then very quickly, some of the areas where alignment perhaps wasn't as strong or slightly weaker. Trade liberalization, I think, remains politically constrained, but we are seeing that shift happen. We quite often refer to Marcani's speech from the World Economic Forum, but I think that is starting to shift. And what does that mean, and how quickly can we move to make sure that the new relationships, again, are beneficial to the continent? Regulatory harmonization, again, we're looking at ESG disclosure frameworks, for example. There still remains fragmentation, but there are global efforts afoot to try to align those. But that's an area where certainly strengthening could be beneficial. And I think maybe more importantly, while the G20 has adopted reform language, it's the implementation mechanisms that I think are remaining underpowered. But that's the opportunity for us going into the continuity, but then also for the next, maybe not in this presidency, but the next one. And this persistent gap between multilateral ambition and domestic execution. So Wendy, I just want to sort of tie up a little bit with saying what that then means for Africa. So where can we be better structurally prepared to absorb capital? And how do we integrate into new supply chains and translate energy transition into industrial growth? And then the alignment of domestic reform pipelines with global financing reforms. So that opportunity, there's an opportunity window, and are we going to act within that window? South Africa is an immediate case in point. We had a speech that we heard last week, and the translation just domestically of some of those things into the action that's needed, our immediate priorities, but then aligning that also with what we're seeing as the shift that's happening globally. And so the implementation partnerships are going to be critical. For every country, I think, on the continent, a big part of that is also going to come from the local institutional capacity and being able to be very clear very quickly where those strengths lies, where capacitation is going to be needing to be improved and enhanced and supported, and then turn quickly into bankable, implementable pipelines. So I think that would be the key ones I'd want to reflect on immediately, Wendy. I think from the other part, what I would look for, the signals that I think African businesses and institutions need to be monitoring a little bit closely is certainly the pace of the MDB capital reform, and we've spoken a bit about that. The evolution in particular on the ESG issues, on the sustainable finance taxonomies, and what does that mean for us, and how do we understand that evolution in order to be able to attract capital and align ourselves to be able to benefit from that. The industrial policy shifts in some of the major economies, but also how are we leading on our own industrial policy shifts, and then the degree of regulatory alignment, particularly in AI and digital governance. There's a huge opportunity, but there's also a huge risk. A lot has been said, I'm sure, in different platforms around inherent bias built into some of these platforms and some of the AI technologies, for example, that I think as Africans we need to be on the front foot of monitoring from a governance perspective. And so for the institutions, strengthening our project preparation pipelines, improving the regulatory clarity that we need in our own spaces, but also how that aligns, and building those blended finance partnerships that I think are going to be so important. But then the coordinated business government reform platforms that we can then use to leverage this positive momentum that we see has started. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Shameela, and thanks, Kaz, as well, for, I think, really great insights on what happened. And I think it's really refreshing to hear I love the word that Kaz was saying about reset that kept coming up. And I heard you both saying we're resetting almost the relationship between business and government and how we work together in collaborative ways to make sure that we have real, true partnerships across the G20 and make sure that emerging economies are developing as throughout that process, and that we are also set up to do that in a way that maximizes benefit for our own local economies as well. So thank you so much for that. I think it was really a great insight. I also loved the theme about implementation, and I know there's an impact tracker that's been put in place now to see how we can actually make sure that with all the changes in presidencies every year, we actually have implementation of some of these great ideas that come to the fore. So we're going to move now onto the panel side of the webinar and welcome Geoff to the discussion as well. And Geoff, I'm going to start with you and ask you, from what you've heard, and I'm sure you're involved as well, but from what you've heard today and from others, where do you see the strongest alignment between these B20 recommendations and the final G20 outcomes? And what does this mean for business priorities, and in particular in Africa as a mechanism for translating some of these business input into global policy outcomes?
Thank you, Wendy. And I want to acknowledge and congratulate the previous speakers, who I think have done a great job. Being a Sherpa, and so far as Cass is concerned, was an amazing undertaking, which he did so well. And Shameela is so active in her sector as well. Well done to them. And on that note, what I'd like to say is we need leadership, and the sort of leadership we've seen from the individuals who were involved, not only at the helm of the B20 groups, but who participated and who undertook to deliver, which is the biggest thing from my point of view, delivery. So what are the strongest alignments that we see? From the perspective of the NEPAD Business Foundation, 3 areas showed meaningful convergence. And I'm sorry, there's going to be a little bit of repetition, but I'm going to go through them. Investment mobilization and de-risking frameworks. There was clear traction on blended finance, risk-sharing instruments, and crowding in the private capital, particularly in infrastructure. And there needs also to be a very strong focus on water, as well as energy transition and industrial development. Trade facilitation and supply chain resilience. The language around resilient supply chains, critical minerals, and regional value chains strongly aligns with Africa's development priorities. Digital trust and ESG alignment, progress towards harmonized disclosure standards, digital trade facilitation, and cross-border interoperability reflects B20 influence. Where did I see that traction was weaker? The speed and specifics struggling of implementation. While communicate recognized priorities, firm timelines, financing envelopes, and accountability mechanisms remained limited. Bankability of African infrastructure. The commitment language is encouraging, but transaction preparation and project pipeline support still requires scale and institutional follow-through. From an NBF lens, alignment exists at policy level. Encouraging progress has been made. The level of people involved so far has been really high, but the unfinished work is in execution architecture.
Thank you so much, Geoff. I just wanted to pick up on something because I think you were the only speaker that we've heard so far talk about water. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that from the African perspective and what you saw and how it links maybe a little bit to food security as well that Kaz was talking about?
Well, I don't think it's any secret that Africa as a whole is a water-scarce continent. And the protection of our resources is just not at a level which enables people to live, businesses to grow, and health to be addressed. So the sustainability and preservation of our water resources and the correct use of funding that's applied into water authorities is absolutely critical for the African continent going forward. If you don't have water, you have death. There's no substitution. So as far as the NBF are concerned, our concentration and our work is being done in that space to ensure that municipalities run properly, that water leaks are attended to, and that all the elements relating to safe water are adhered to. We have been successful in working with some municipalities already and have MOUs with others. And this is our drive. This is what we will deliver on.
Thank you, Geoff. Do any of the other panel members want to just comment on anything that Geoff raised there about water?
Wendy. Oh, sorry. Nothing specifically more than what Geoff has said. I think he said it very eloquently about the challenges we face. And it has to be a priority. And, it's both the gray and the green infrastructure. And by that, I mean, it's the pipes and it's the infrastructure that we have, just the physical infrastructure. But very importantly for the continent is going to be the maintenance of our natural capital. Because if we're not able to preserve that, the natural catchments and so on and so forth, and be able to ensure that those can service adequately, we're just going to increase the severity of the issues that we're facing. And so it's a continent that bonds so much at this natural capital, which is important for a variety of reasons, including a significant and GDP dependence on that. But from a water perspective specifically, there's an even greater concentration. Secondly, related to water and scarcity and water cycles, of course, is the entire climate issue. And to the extent that, that nature provides the carbon sinks and is critical, the ability to be able to understand the value of that natural capital for the continent is a very much related issue as well. And the role that plays in regulating the global climate. And so those two things for me are very interrelated. Water security, natural capital, and also then obviously the impact that has broadly on climate, which then again has an impact on water.
And Kaz, do you think that those issues that Shameela has spoken about were discussed in an integrated way at the G20? And B20? Can you give us some insight into those discussions?
Well, we didn't have a specific sort of focus on water at the B20 at the task force level. We discussed water as part of the infrastructure and finance task force and the importance of water. So it was, there was some focus on it, and it found its way into some of the recommendations. Just to say that in South Africa itself, as South Africans would know, we've had a business-government partnership for the last 4 years, focusing on energy, logistics, and crime and corruption, where business has provided capacity and expertise to government to deal with some of those issues, and it's been fairly successful. There is a view now that we should add water as a fourth task force and work together in a much more structured way between business and government to address that. I think that's being considered at the moment.
Okay, super. Thank you. I think a number of people are putting on the Q&A the issue about corruption and the fact that, all of this requires that we deal with corruption adequately and in a way that is transparent for investors. Anybody want to address that issue about corruption, and was it addressed, was it discussed significantly in the meetings, and what were some of the outcomes?
Let me take a shot. We did have a task force on business and ethics, so corruption was discussed there. I think obviously corruption is a critical issue, and if we don't deal with corruption, we can't actually achieve a lot of what we want to do. The sort of recommendation that came out of the B20. But this is where I think real leadership comes in, and strong leadership from business. I think that one of the reasons why corruption is beginning to be addressed in South Africa was because of significant organized business pressure, and and some role played by organized business in helping to deal with corruption. Even though corruption, there are some businesses that have been involved in the corruption, as it takes two to play in that area. But I think that we need that sort of an effort across the continent, and that's why I think that some of the things we're looking at, some sort of strong structure on the continent that enables business to work much more closely with government and other stakeholders to deal with some of the issues we need to deal with. I think corruption is one of those, and we need zero tolerance from business. We need business to actually ensure that we punish and deal with corruption in our own ranks, so that we actually put our money where our mouth is, for want of a better term. But part of corruption is to ensure that we have the appropriate institutions, the appropriate legal system, and so on to deal with corruption. And those are things that we need to look at as we start implementing these recommendations.
I want to go back to Geoff and ask a question about, so we've had this outcomes, we've got impact trackers that people are suggesting. There's a lot of things that are going to be done in terms of implementation, but beyond the communiques and declarations that came out of G20, what are, in your views, the unfinished agenda that business needs to make sure that we track and influence going forward in these discussions? Because you've obviously made a great start, as we said, in resetting and profiling Africa as a resource, as an opportunity. What are the things that we need to do to make sure we keep that momentum going? And then Kaz and Shameela, if you could also give your thoughts on that once Geoff has given his input. Geoff.
The signals that African business and investors should watch from, once again, an NBF perspective, the key signals are blended finance scaling mechanisms, energy transition funding tied to industrialization, supply chain repositioning towards Africa, standard alignment in ESG and digital trade, and critical minerals value addition policy frameworks. Most importantly, do these commitments translate into project preparation facilities and risk mitigation instruments? The challenge here again is going to be leadership. It's going to be strong leadership to address these various aspects and to make a difference.
Thank you, Geoff. Kaz, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Geoff has covered that. And let me not add anything to that. I think that's gone to other stuff.
Okay, cool. Shameela?
I think same here. Those are the main ones. I'm going to emphasize the domestic capacity though, and that there are many things that domestically we do need to get right. And so those things are the ones that we focus on, because that then positions us to be ready to be able to take advantage of that. And so South Africa, I mean, we know the reforms that are happening, largely we look at Operation Vulindlela as just a guidepost for what some of that is. And for our international participants on the call, that is really the government kind of identification of the key unlocks in the country that need to be looked at. And Cass mentioned some of those already, but that is the national energy issues with the Crisis Committee on Energy, the logistics issues, the joint initiatives on crime and corruption, and then potentially this fourth pillar are looking at water. And so those are the sort of things that absolutely create the foundation so that you are able to get onto the opportunity, and then completely concur with what Geoff has said.
Shameela, while I've got you, can I perhaps, I think you mentioned it earlier, and I think you were the only one that did. You spoke about AI and digitalization. So just give us a bit more on that. What are some of the issues that were discussed, and what are the things that Africa really has to pay attention to make sure that we don't get left behind in this very fast-paced moving sector?
You had to leave the easy question for me, Wendy. Thank you. I walked into that, didn't I? But so firstly, I'm definitely not an expert in AI, but what we're noticing, firstly, we know that digital that is happening whether we like it or not, and the AI revolution is absolutely on its way. So the key issues, and I mentioned some of it before, is going to be around the governance of AI, understanding what it does, how it works, but also for us as a continent, particularly to make sure that we're watching that it doesn't create a bigger divide. So do we have the infrastructure, and are we making sure we're building the infrastructure so that the benefits of the upside of that can actually be widespread on our continent. So the huge opportunities we have will be to leapfrog in certain areas. There are huge and positive implications potentially for access in terms of education as one of those, increasing efficiencies and enhancing those sorts of things. Those are absolutely beneficial. So from the inclusive growth agenda, there is huge opportunities. But if we're not careful about making sure that that access is enhanced, it then becomes the complete opposite, which is increasing the divide. And so that's the one. The second one, I think, is around governance. I mentioned some of that issue earlier on, talking about the way in which these things are programmed and how that actually looks at our populations and whether there are inbuilt prejudices. And that has been quite a big topic, particularly in the sustainability area, where we're looking at, are we being exclusionary? Who is programming that? Is the lens actually considering a bigger populace, diverse populations, and how's that happening? Because we're looking at the back end, which is very useful. I type in something into my AI assistant, but what is it thinking on? What is it trained on? Do we have understanding of those things so that it's enhanced for us as a population and actually adequately embraces diversity so that what you're getting out is valuable? So I think on that side, those are the ones I would want to look at. The huge opportunities, obviously, for efficiency gains, and how do we do that? There are obviously concerns, and this topic is a topic for another 4-hour discussion, right? About does that potentially then start to eat away at jobs? And, where we have huge unemployment issues across the continent, and in South Africa, a typical case in point, is that going to potentially then put jobs at risk? And what jobs and what kinds of jobs? And what is that strategy going into the future? So where we're talking about industrialization on a continent that largely needs to employ huge populations, are we making sure that we understand what the upside is of AI and the efficiency gains we can have versus the types of jobs that we're preparing for? I think is going to be very important. So those are some of the implications on AI that we need to be thinking about. I am, of course, I think personally most concerned about governance. The other part of it is that within that broader digitization thing is going to be the impact on the youth and the growing population. There is serious concern around the other side of this, particularly in social media, and then the combination of that with AI, which is the social engineering and the increasing levels of what we call perceived addiction in these spaces. So those are other things that we need to look at. Then the skills revolution that can be associated with that. And I think there were some comments around looking at this increasing population on the continent, one of the few places in the world with increasing youth population, which effectively could really be that beneficial into the future as being providing some of the base for skills into the future. But then what kind of skills are we training for? Are we making sure that those things will allow us to realize this dividend that we're saying the youth population could potentially give us? So paying attention to all of those, using AI as an enabler, and being careful about where it potentially creates bigger divides if we're not being very, very deliberate about how it's being used and incorporated.
Thank you so much, Shameela. I want to just turn to the future now before we get into some of the questions that we've got in the Q&A, of which there are quite a few. But I just wanted to, before we finish the panel side, just ask Kaz in particular about, but everyone else is welcome to contribute. But what are some of the lessons that we learned from this most successful B20 process that you facilitated that need to be incorporated as the norm into future B20 processes? And what shifts in emphasis do you think, so that's on the process side, but from a policy side, what shift in emphasis do you anticipate under the current USA and in the UK G20 presidencies, and how this may impact continuity on some of the issues that are raised? I mean, I'm involved in the BRICS process, and I know every time you change the chair, the people are different, have different emphasis. So how are we going to make sure that these African issues continue on into the future? Kaz?
Yeah, so I think just to begin with, one needs to understand the nature of the G20 and link to that the B20 and the structure of it. We learned as we moved along, because this was the first time we did this last year. And we had expectations that the structure just could not meet. So a couple of things related to that. I mean, essentially the host country does what it wants to do. There's no rules. There's no guidelines really, except what the previous country did. So that's the first point. The second point is that the G20 and hence the B20 doesn't have a permanent secretary. So continuity is extremely difficult. Okay. What we've tried to do, is whether we can establish some sort of a grouping of Sherpas that can meet regularly and talk to each other and see where these recommendations are going. So at this point in time, the US, ourselves, the UK, and South Korea, which is in 2028, will form some sort of a structure just to see how we can follow through what we can do with the recommendation that haven't been met and so on. So we tried to start something. Let's see what it builds. Maybe it'll end up to be a secretariat in a couple of years' time that could do that. So from a continuity point of view, I mean, as I said earlier, to a certain extent, we're looking beyond the US because one, South Africa isn't represented in the G20. So that makes continuity in the US virtually impossible. And we don't want to be represented through anybody else. We're either there or we're not there. Secondly, a number of the issues we've dealt with, like a significant focus on trade and industry, is not there either on the B20 side or the G20. Significant focus on energy and just transition issue is not there at all. Focus on ethics and business, not there at all. There's some degree of industrialization that maybe we can work on, but very little of that as well. I think there is a focus on digitalization, and we certainly have in fact circulated our chairs to see if anybody wants to participate in a work group on digitalization, including particularly financial digitalization. So it's going to be extremely difficult. So that's why we want talking to the UK and see how we can work with the UK to ensure that there's continuity from South Africa, to what extent the UK can incorporate some of the issues that we dealt with and some of the priorities that came up, and work with the UK to see how many of our recommendations get implemented or not, and then take back what is not implemented and see what we can do about that. So I think, and then, what future B20 should focus on, so on. I mean, we can't run away from the fact that it's geopolitics oversee a lot of this. Even in our B20, in our sort of guidance to the task force chair, who said, of course you're going to discuss the geopolitics. You have to. But don't let that demobilize you from discussing what you really need to discuss and come out with recommendations on what really matters. And that's how we dealt with it. But I think that I think future B20s need to focus on the shifting sense of economic and where economic growth is happening, where the biggest economies are, and what their thinking is. What are the conurbations that need to come together to actually drive economic growth? what are the critical issues related to economic growth, including issues of ethics, including issues of regulation in the AI space, including issues of ensuring inclusive economies, because it's quite clear that the way economic growth is happening today worldwide is not actually talking to the problem that ordinary people have, and it's not dealing effectively with poverty, with inequality, with unemployment in many sectors. So I think it's those sort of issues that we're going to have to look out for.
Thank you so much, Kaz. I think the issue around the different emphasis in focus and not necessarily focusing on things like inequality is really the big shift we see as we move between the developed and developing countries being chairs. Yeah. I'm just going to now move on to a couple of the questions that we have. So there's one for Shameela specifically about the gap that you mentioned between multinational ambition and domestic execution. And what do you think are the two biggest constraints that keep us from converting these global commitments into delivery? And then if we do, and we actually have these bankable, implementable pipelines, what are some of the minimum ingredients you think must exist there for these pipelines to move, especially for big industrialization and transition infrastructure projects?
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you to Pindile for the questions. So, Wendy, I'm just struggling. I've been trying to type on there, but it keeps moving me out for some reason, so I couldn't answer live. So, on the first portion of that question, I think looking at the institutional capacity and the governance, if I had to choose from those that are put out, then I don't think they're necessarily the only things we need to look at, but I think that is important. The next part is absolutely the finance. So, we talked a little bit about MDB reform, which talks to some of the global financial architecture and what it is kind of pivoted towards, right? Which includes how it understands risk, which includes credit ratings. So if we're on the back foot because of these systems that are skewed against us and don't properly understand our operating context, there will be a constraint on the flow of the capital. So that is from a broader architecture perspective on the capital that needs to flow to support those projects. But then, of course, before that, from what we can actually have some level of control over, of course, is the governance. In making sure we have the right governance there that is applicable and that is actually satisfactory to investors, for example, but that just allows us to know that we have proper handle on things. And then the institutional capacity. That is a constraint in many instances, but I don't think one that we can't unlock. And there we've seen a lot of, for example, positives when we've seen business-government partnerships, for example, and that comes through where it brings to the best of both worlds and that there's a willingness on both sides and an architecture that allows for that to happen. So I think if I had to pick on that first question, that would be, could you please remind me the second part of the question, Wendy?
Sorry, it's disappeared. Oh, let me just check.
So yeah, that's why I said things were moving around and I couldn't type. Yep.
The second part, I think, was what are the elements around the sorry, my computer screen is now frozen. What governance mechanisms should South Africa put in place to ensure that you convert this exposure into bankable projects?
Yeah. So I think the governance mechanisms are, again, around understanding the institutional capacity and what that actually entails. And I don't think it's necessarily just the governance mechanism. It's about saying the capacity to be able to understand that translated to make it investor ready and investor attractive. Those are important. And then after that, of course, the governance to make sure that there can be enhanced confidence in continuing investment, the feedback mechanisms, the monitoring and evaluation of those projects. And those are things that we would need to make sure we keep there. So the bankable part, of course, talks to risk and risk sharing in those things that are not immediately bankable, but that are critical for investment. And so that's where things like blended finance mechanisms come in. So that's where you see the rubber hits the road between what we'd like to do the perceived or the real risk in it, and then the money that needs to flow to it. So we've got, I think those are some of the layers we would need to look at, and then governance will need to focus on saying, are we sure ourselves that that money is flowing correctly, and is there a level of accountability, transparency, and mechanisms around that, including the legal and the judicial systems, for example, that bring the confidence that's needed.
And our CK has also put a comment on that in the Q&A as well. Thank you for that. I just want to revert. One of the questions from Ronald is about food security. And Kaz, I know you mentioned that at the beginning as being so important for Africa. And the question from Ronald is that that implies that we have to transform the agriculture sector. And how much was this discussed, and what are the kinds of issues that came up about transformation of the agriculture sector?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. Look, the chair of our Food Security and Agriculture Task Force was Deborah Maloa, the head of Bayer in Africa and based in Kenya. And she talked to a number of very exciting initiatives, particularly in the small and medium agricultural sector that are happening on the continent. And these aren't just normal sort of the usual way of agricultural output. These are small and medium agricultural businesses that are using digitalization, that are using AI to actually optimize their business and optimize what they produce. And so I think to a certain extent, because as sort of governments and even leaders in other parts of society, we haven't proactively created the environment for agricultural transformation, entrepreneurs have basically started doing this themselves. And so agriculture is transforming on the continent. Is it having the sort of impact that we need it to have? No. So I think that what needs to happen is we must understand what is already happening. We must understand what entrepreneurs are actually doing. We must learn from that and then look at what sort of policy and regulatory environment is needed to actually make that impactful and grow that and develop that, not impede that, but make that impactful and grow that and develop. So catch up with where people are and enable that to impact. There's a danger in there. Governments usually, what happens when they see where people are at, they then want to overregulate. And that's not what I'm talking about. Catch up to where people are, understand what people are doing, learn from that, and then see what government and corporates also need to do in those environments to actually enable that to become more impactful, to grow, to develop. And I think that's what we need to do. And that's the sort of transformation that's needed.
Thank you so much. Geoff, is there anything you want to add on agriculture from the African perspective?
I think what's been said is very valid. And I think the important thing is exactly what Cass said. Don't overregulate, don't overtax, and see that you encourage rather than destroy. And I think what we've seen on the continent all too often is suddenly when something is doing well in a particular space, governments see it as a revenue opportunity rather than looking to the future and the benefits for society.
Thank you, Geoff. So I think we're going to conclude by asking a question of each of the panelists around, so we've heard a lot about B20, we heard the outcomes of the G20. How do you see going forward that we translate these, where needed, these B20 outcomes into policy reforms across the different countries that we are involved in the G20, given that there's a whole lot of them? And so while we may agree at the G20 level, how are we going to translate that into those 20 countries' policy reforms? And what's the best way that we can, as business, help facilitate that process? So I'll start with you, Kaz, if that's okay, and then Geoff and Shameela. And then if you would like to just give some closing comments as part of this answer as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the B20 and to a certain extent the G20 is all about policy formulation and policy issues. And that's what they are. And then implementation recommendations are made, but they then have to be implemented usually by the G20, but the G20 usually farm that out to multilateral institutions like the World Bank and so on. And that's what we've got to track. But how the policy outcomes from the B20 and G20, how those are implemented, and how do we ensure that those policy changes happen? I think, and this is why I think certainly at the African level, we feel strongly that if we don't have some sort of coordinated, and let me use Africa as an example, some sort of coordinated continental business leadership that actually interacts on these issues, recognizes how important an appropriate policy environment is, and then interacts with the G20 and other structures to see what is happening, and if things aren't happening, why they're not happening. And then to the sort of local partnerships we have between business and government to see whether we can have multilateral partnerships between business and government to enable that. So I think it's those sorts of issues that need to be tackled, but that need that sort of leadership structure in different continents and at a multilateral level to actually do that. And it's difficult. I mean, as I said, it's a large structure, the G20, and as I said, it doesn't have a secretariat and so on. So you essentially leave it to those countries to do what they can, and to the extent that they're interested in doing what they can. But if there are a couple of sort of multilateral sort of touch points in different continents, then maybe we can actually put pressure as business on the G20 as an organ on its own, but on some of the critical countries. And just concluding remarks, I think this has been great. The questions and interaction has been great from different parts of the world. And what it basically says is that we need to keep our shoulders to the wheel in a very complex environment. But what came out of the B20, and I think nobody said anything to the contrary here, despite what may be happening in some parts of the world, multilateralism is still important, but with the reset multilateral organizations and countries and need to work together to actually address the challenges that the globe has.
Thank you so much, Cass. Geoff?
I can one summarize better than what Cass has done. So thank you to the organizers. Thanks for the ability to participate. And if you want to convince others, you need to start at home. And I believe South Africa, through Operation Vulindlela, the initiatives of BUSA, Business Leadership South Africa, are really putting their foot forward to make sure that we go into a good future for the next generation. And we need to spread that word, that start at home, and spread it.
Thank you, Geoff. Shameela, last but not least.
No, thank you, Wendy. For me, it's just, I think, in addition, a constant, I think, education around the issues and being able to understand what is happening at the international level, and then the drill down into the local relevance and the implementation. Because the more awareness there is around what work has been done, the more pressure you can build, or the more interest you can build locally, and then different institutions, different types of different areas, walks of life are actually able to work with that and say, what is that recommendation? So the work's been done, what's important, why is it important, and how do I, in my space, help to advance that objective? And I think that's important. So up to now, if you speak to people, be like, oh, what really happened? Why is B20, G20 important to me? And so I think that ongoing education, which webinars like this help us with, are hugely important. And that let's rally around those outcomes to say where we can make that happen in different spaces. So thank you, Wendy. And thanks to everybody who participated as well today. Really good to see the active interest.
Okay, so I think that brings us to the end. Just suffice to say thank you so much to the three panelists. Having worked at some of these international processes, I know how frustrating and complex it can be. But I always used to take comfort from the fact that if you didn't have them, we wouldn't move forward. So even though we may seem to move slowly sometimes, I think we are at least going in the right direction and having the right discussions. But thank you so much to everybody, and thank you to Carolynn and NBI, to Good Governance Academy and NBI as well, for partnering with us on this. And we will see you at another webinar to be confirmed in the future.